Hi everyone, this is Cal from Cal Made It, and today I'm going to be sewing a mushroom animal frog, this little guy here, from the Mushroom Animals pattern from Sew de Sune. You can get this pattern on their website. I will link it in the show notes. So let's go to the machine and I will show you the parts. Okay, everyone, so let's go over our parts that we're going to need for our frog. So I have the main front part with the eyes, which I have done on my embroidery machine. Okay, I'm not going to go over how to do the embroidery. I will do a separate video on how I embroider for plushies. You can use the applique templates from the pattern and just hand stitch appliques for these parts if you'd like. And then let's see, we have a belly piece that's going to go in the insert part of the frog. We have two pieces that are the back of the frog, and we have two pieces that are essentially going to be sewn to the front here for the inner leg parts. So these are going to get attached here. Okay. And then there's a few other pieces. There are feet, which I have made a file on my embroidery machine to do these, but you can just trace the pattern, cut it out, and sew your seam allowance. I'll go over that as well. And then I did the same thing with the arms. But again, you can just trace the pattern with your pen on your fabric, and then you can stitch it like you would anything else for this. And these get stitched completely all the way around, and then you just snip a little hole in the back to stuff them before you attach them. So I will go over that as well. But these are not files that you get in the pattern. I did these on my own just to make my life quicker because I sew a lot of these things to sell. I'm just going to turn on a few more of my sewing machine lights. And let's, oops. Oh, helps to not drag your arm through the pin cushion. Okay, so let's get started. And the first thing we're going to want to do is we are going to sew the darts at the forehead of our frog and so this dart here and the dart at the bottom of the belly. So I'm going to start with the belly just because it's just a little bit easier to grab this piece right now. And I'm just pinning. So I've pinned my dart, and now I'm going to sew this closed. I'm going to take a marker though, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to sew this. So let me grab a ruler real quick. I just want to mark the 1/4 inch seam that is normally, okay, so you're normally going to sew your 1/4 inch seam, but with a dart, so you don't end up with this super sharp point, so you have like a pointy headed frog. What you want to do is you want to blend that dart. Now this, I said on the head, but this works for the belly too. You don't want a little point sticking out of its belly. So I've drawn a line here to show you how I'm going to sew the dart starting at my 1/4 inch seam allowance, but then I'm going to blend it in to the seam so that it's more of a gradual curve to it. So I've just set it up to start sewing at 1/4 inch. And then I'm just gradually blending that dart into the seam. Some people don't backstitch on darts. They pull their threads long and tie them. I've found that it really doesn't make a difference either way for me. So as you can see, it's a long dart there, but it blends in really nicely. Now I like to trim my seam allowances. It doesn't say to do this in the pattern, but you can, or you can leave it, totally up to you. So now I'm gonna set the body aside and I'm gonna pin the head piece so I can sew the dart on that. And again, I'm gonna start with the 1/4 inch seam allowance and I'm gonna blend it very gradually into the seam. I'm gonna start up here and I'm gonna blend it very slowly into the seam, to almost to the point of the mouth here. Very gradual blending. Okay, just trimming off my thread tails. I'm gonna trim my seam allowance there. Again, you don't have to do that. I just find it helps when stuffing things for the seam to lay. Now, as you can see, that dart goes almost down to his mouth. Okay, all right, now we need to sew the darts on the back body pieces. So I'm just going to take all of these, pins out, okay. So I'm gonna grab this one, and there's a dart here on the back of the eye, and then there's a dart, dart here on the back of the eye, and there's a dart down here that's gonna be on the back of the frog. So I'm gonna start with the bigger one. And again, I'm just gonna pin these. To hold everything nice and smooth. And I'm gonna sew, again, blending into that seam. I'm gonna be nice and gradual. I'll see if I can hold that up for you so you can see the gradual sloping into the seam there. Trim that seam down. Okay, now I'm gonna do the same thing up here. This one's a really tiny little piece, so I'm only gonna need one pin up here. Okay, so I'm gonna pin that, and again, starting with the 1/4 inch, and very gradually blending it into the seam. Okay, I'll show you that one. All right, and I just dropped my scissors. That happens a lot. Okay, so that side is done. I'm gonna set that aside, and I'm gonna do the same thing on my other body piece. Before I do that though, I marked the specific stitch points for certain things on the one side. I'm gonna grab my pattern piece and I'm gonna mark those on the other side as well, because when I cut them out, I lay them together. So like on the pattern piece, there's dots that help you align very specific things. So I'm going to mark those on this particular piece now, since I did not do that before. And it's just making sure everything is lined up. All right, so that is, got all my points marked. That one looks like it's a little far in there. Let me fix that. Yeah, sometimes when you pin stuff together, it's hard to lay things flat sometimes. The fabric has got some stretch to it, so. All right, I've got all my points marked on here, so now I'm gonna go ahead and sew my darts on this piece. Gradual slope. Pull out my pins, trim down my seam allowance. And now I'm going to do the same thing for this upper dart that will be the back of the eye. Bulge. Okay. Trim this one up. I'm just taking off about half of the seam allowance when I trim. All right, so now I have 2 body pieces. Okay, now I'm going to set these aside and I'm going to attach the belly into the front of the frog. Okay, all right, so it doesn't look like I marked the center on here. So I'm going to do that now. I just fold it in half and take a pencil and mark my center point. All right. And it doesn't look like because I did embroidery for this, when I cut it out, I forgot to add those marking points again to help you line things up. So I'm just going to do that very quickly. Just going to mark my points here. It's a little harder to do now that the dart is there, but you just kind of have to maneuver the pattern piece a little bit to get it to lay in the corner of that area. All right, so I'm just making sure that I'm lined up there and mark that. And then, like I said, it's harder once it's embroidered and cut out to make sure. Now, it has a dot for the center line that I marked, but you can also mark it the way that I did by just folding it in half to get that center point there. I did, however, mark all of the points on the belly piece. So we're going to, there's 3 points here. There's 1 up at the top center, and then there's 2 down toward the bottom of the belly that are going to line up with these points here. So I'm going to start by lining up the center of the belly with that mark. And then I like to take the leg part, or the part that will be down by the leg, and I'm going to line that up. And I'm going to pin that. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side here. I'm going to line that one up using the dots that we added to the fabric as reference. Okay. And then now I'm just going to pin all the way around, easing things in if needed so that the pieces fit together. if you find that your minky rolls in, you can pin from the opposite side. So I pinned, sticking the pin in, entering from the green side before, you can pin, I pinned from the yellow side if you're concerned about the minky rolling in and not stitching nice and flat. And you don't have to do it everywhere. You can just do it where you notice that there's some issues there. This area here looks like it kind of came a little bit shifty. That's another thing, minky shifts a lot. So when it comes to pinning, if you think you've pinned it enough, pin it some more. That'll help keep things from shifting. So I'm just throwing in a few more pins here where I think it needs it because of the rolling. And then we'll go ahead and sew around. Oops. Okay, now we're just going to stitch right around from 0.5 all the way around to 4, and then from 4 down to 5 on the opposite side. You should pull your pins out as you go. I don't always do that because I tend to sew fast. But if you don't pull your pins out, please wear eye protection because you never know what might happen when a needle hits a pin and the pin can snap and parts can fly, or the needle can break and the parts of the needle can fly. So if you're not gonna pull your pins before you sew over them, please wear eye protection. Okay, just snipping off the tails from the thread and pull the rest of my pins out here. Okay, so that is sewn all the way around. Now I'm going to trim this. You do not have to. I'm going to trim that seam allowance to about half. But again, you don't have to do that. That's just something that I've found I think makes things, the seams lay nicer once I stuff the plush. If you are going to trim on a curve like this, just take it slow because things like to roll and sometimes you can get a little bit too close to the actual seam. You don't want to do that and snip through your stitching. Okay, that's all trimmed up. So now that lays nice. Okay, now we're going to set this aside. Set the front of the frog body aside. And the next step it tells us to do is to sew the back mostly together, leaving an opening for turning. But before I do that, I am going to add my business label because I make these and sell them, which is okay to do. Permission has been given by the plush creator. Just don't claim the plush pattern as your own. If I'm asked by a customer at a show, I do tell them that I use patterns that I purchase. I tend to make sure that all of my Etsy listings in my shop are say where I got my patterns from. So you want to credit the designer of the pattern. Now I'm going to line up the back seam. And I'm going to line up the where the darts are. Use that as another point to anchor. And then line up that. Okay, now I'm going to add some more pins here. Okay, and then also part way up the back. Like that. And then down a little ways from the top. That looks, oh, that pin didn't go through. Okay, there we go. So I have pinned from the top to here, and then I've left a gap, and then from here to the bottom. Now I'm gonna sew two parts. I'm gonna sew from here, then I'm gonna cut my thread, and then I'm gonna sew from here down so that I leave this part open so that I have a place to put the stuffing in. The beginning and end of each seam you want to back stitch a little bit just so that you make sure you lock your stitches. Okay. Trim the long threads. I'm going to pull out all my pins, and I'm going to trim this seam allowance, but I'm not going to trim the area here that I will have to sew up by hand after I stuff the frog. So I'm going to trim, and then when I get close to that opening, I'm just going to taper off to the edge. And then when I do the top, I'm just going to go past the opening and just kind of taper in to trim that seam allowance down. So it looks like that. Okay, now I can set this back of the frog aside. And now I'm going to grab the front of my frog and my inner leg pieces, and these are going to get attached. So this is the way they should lay. So I'm going to take them and turn them in and pin them on. And they also have the little reference dots, so you can make sure that you're lining them up correctly. Just gonna make sure yep, those are lined up correctly. And then I'm going to just pin the inner leg. To the main body piece. Again, you can pin from both sides if your minky tends to roll. So you can pin from here, flip it over, pin from there. Now I'm going to do this other side. Oops. That piece does not have markings on it. So I'm going to just have to eyeball this one. I know it lines up there. Oops. Now you could do one side at a time. You don't have to do them both like me. You can just line up one edge, sew, then line up the other leg and stitch that. I just tend to, since I don't, the pinning won't interfere with stitching on the other side, so I just do both the pinnings right away. Then I don't accidentally drop the tiny piece on the floor somewhere to have to hunt for, because I've accidentally swept it off the sewing table. Okay, so those are now both pinned, and now I'm going to sew those seams. back stitching at the front of the seam, taking the curve slow so that I keep a consistent seam allowance. Okay, that's one side done, so I can pull out the pins there, and then I'll do the other side. If you want to get a nice curve, you could do what I just did there, where I stopped with my needle down, lifted my presser foot, pivoted my material, and then put the presser foot back down and continued sewing. If you have very tight curves, that is the best way to go about getting nice smooth seams on those. Okay, so now that is done. So I am going to once again trim my seam allowances down, being careful that I don't get too close and snip through the stitching. Do that on both sides. Okay, all right, so now that is ready to be sewn to the back. So now you have these two pieces that got lots of bumps and lumps, and you want to sew them together. You could try to do it all in one go, but that is actually going to be very difficult. So the instructions have you line up certain points first. So we're going to line up the dots here. Making sure I have these lined up correctly. Yep, okay. So that is, let me grab my pattern. Sorry if I got out of microphone range there. Okay, so we're gonna sew from 1 to 2, okay? From 1 to 2. So that's just this little seam right here. So I'm gonna go do that. I'm gonna put my needle in right at that dot for 1. So that it's, and then I'm going to sew through to where the dot for 2 is and backstitch. Okay. So that's all I sewed, was that little seam there. Okay. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to match up my dots 1 and 2. And 2 on here is this leg joint seam, okay? It's hard to see once you sew that part together. So it's that, it is the seam there. And now I'm going to, whoops. Now I'm going to sew that section from point 1 to point 2. Just trying to make sure everything lays flat. Okay. Trim my threads. Okay, so I've sewn this side as well. Now I'm going to sew from 2 to 3, 2 to 3, which is around this leg, basically the leg bump. So I'm just going to you kind of have to kind of maneuver the fabric in order to get it to align with the curve of the bump on the back of the frog. And then this dot down here aligns with this seam. So I'm going to pin that. Okay. And then you just kind of have to kind of push out your bump of the thigh. So that your fabrics line up there. Making sure there's no pleats in your fabric. This is a section where pinning from the opposite side of the fabric is going to be very helpful, because on these curves, the legs tend to, the minky on the one side tends to want to roll under. Oops, that one didn't go through. And now the last one there. Okay, now again, you can sew this or you can pin the other side first and sew it. I'll do them one at a time. Okay, and I'm just seeing where my stitching ended before, and that's where I'm going to drop my needle down to start this seam. And making sure that if my fabric bunches up, I'm lifting my presser foot and maneuvering it so that the fabric lays flat again. These curves really like to bunch up. Okay, and I'm looking to see where my other dot is, which should be right by that seam. Okay, so now that section is done. So I'll pull out these pins, and I'm going to repeat this process on the other side. And your first dot should be lined up because that's where you stitched to before. That's where you stitched down from the top. So that one's already lined up. So you just want to pin there, and then you can go around to the bottom and see where those dots line up. And then again, just kind of flare out your inner thigh piece so that it follows the outer thigh piece on the back of the frog. Sometimes it helps to do a couple pins from each end and work your way toward each other, because then you're not stretching your minky in any particular direction. That can distort it. Okay. And again, if you feel the need to pin from the other side, you can. I think I'm good on this one. So I am going to search for that dot, and I'm going to start sewing from there this time. Carefully around, making sure that my fabric stays flat. And if you need to, you can pick up your presser foot and kind of smooth things out. Again, if the curve seems tight to you, it is okay to lift your presser foot and readjust the fabric. And I'm going to just keep stitching around till I meet up with that other seam that I stitched earlier from 1 to 2. Pull this pin out so I can snip the longer thread tails there. Okay. So now that thigh is attached. Now we need to attach the top where the eyeballs are. So I'm going to pin the center darts on the front to the back seam, and then there's dots here at the beginning of the bulge and then at the number ones where we did before. So this is essentially sewing from 1 around to 6 across and then back from 6 to 1. This is going to be closed up here. So you're going to go from 1 to 6 across the top and then from 6 to 1. And smooth your eye bulges together. All right, I have pinned from 6 or from 1 to 6 across the top, and then from 6 to 1, and now I'm going to sew across there. So I'm going to start at that dot where my seam that I started with ended originally. Okay, so I'm matching up the seam ends. I'm very carefully going around the bump of the eye to that next dot, which is 6. Then I'm going to lift up my presser foot and pivot so that I can follow the natural curve of the top here, how it was cut, across to the next bump that is 6. Pivot again, and then go around the eye bump. To meet up with where I started seam from that point that was marked as 1. Okay, I'm going to trim these little things. Okay, so now you have a seam from here over, across, and then around that one. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is sew up this bottom part, the opening at the bottom. Okay, so that we're going to go from 5 across to the other 5. Okay, so there's a dot here at this seam and there's a dot on the back of the frog. So you're going to line those up, the dot with the seam. Oops. And then on the other side, you're going to align the dot on the back of the frog with the seam on the front of the body, where the belly and the body meet. Okay. And then you're going to pin the rest of this shut. Okay. Just straightening things out and pinning it, and then lining up your center seam for the back with your dart on the belly. I'll line those up and pin all the way across. Okay. Sometimes things get a little funky where those leg joins are, so that things might be a little weird, and you can just kind of fudge that a bit the best you can. So now I'm going to sew across from this dot 5 here to this dot 5 here, going straight across. Okay, so I'm going to put this in, and I'm going to find where I ended that seam when I was sewing the legs, the thigh bumps, where that ended, and I'm going to go there, and that's where I'm going to drop my needle so that I can go across. Okay, and I'm going to go across the bottom till I get to where that other thigh seam ended, and back stitch from right there. Okay, I am trimming any long threads, pulling out any pins. Definitely want to make sure all the pins are out. And then I'm just going to check to make sure that everything looks like it's sewn well, There's no weird creases or holes or anything like that. And that looks like that is okay, but might be a little bit weird. So I'm gonna just stick my finger in there and just make sure that there are no accidental openings because something didn't quite get stitched down. Okay, so that looks good. So now you don't have to do this, but I just like to snip very carefully into any pivot points, not through the stitching, just up to it. Okay, because that will just help things lay better when you stuff them. Okay, so I'm just getting any pivot points there. And then here by the eye bulges, there are some, and just before the forehead. Okay, and then over here. Okay, now it doesn't say to do this either, but I am going to trim the seam allowance on my eye bulges. Okay. And this side here, oops. And just be careful you don't get too close to your stitching. Okay. And you do not have to do this at all. I just find it makes the seams lay nicer when I stuff it. And then I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm just gonna trim the seam allowance on the thigh bulges. Because that'll just make those lay a bit nicer once the stuffing goes in, because you won't have that thick bunch of fabric in the seam there. Making sure I didn't snip anything open. I have been known to accidentally snip a little too close, so I just, if I'm not sure, I stick my finger in and kind of push against the seam, make sure. All right, now I need to do this one. Here. Like I said, I'm just taking off about half of the seam, so about 1/8 of an inch of the fabric, since your seams should be 1/4 inch. Okay, so that's all good. And then now you can turn your frog inside out, or right side out, I should say. And I leave this piece here, the seam, because I'm going to attach the magnet pouch there eventually. And you don't really need to do these other parts. They're not going to be a problem when you put the stuffing in, because there's not too much of a curve there. Like there's a pretty big curve on these thighs. So we're just going to turn him inside out to see how he looks. So just push him through the opening you left in the back. And then you can use your fingers to kind of poke out all the round parts like the eye bulges and that, or you can use chopsticks. I think chopsticks are great for this because they have a nice blunt end, so you aren't likely to poke through your seams. And then I just push out my thighs just to get those seams looking nice. Okay, yeah, that looks good. Okay. All right. So there's a little unstuffed frog. Later I will add the magnet and show you how to add the magnet and attach the arms and the feet and put the pellet pouch in. The next part that we need to take care of for our frog is we need to make the little pouch to put the magnet to attach the hat, the mushroom hat that we'll make to the frog. Now, if you're not making the mushroom hat, or you just want to hand tack the hat on the frog, you can completely skip this part. But I would like to actually do that. So I am going to sew a little circular pouch. It's about 1/2 inch bigger than the overall magnet I'm going to put in it. And I'm just stitching around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance And I need to grab my magnets. Okay, now this is the size magnet I got, and these are the super strong rare earth magnets. So we're gonna use those, and you're gonna need 2 of these, one for the frog and one for the hat. You basically do the same thing for this, but I'm just gonna sew one to show you how to do it, and then you'd make a second one to put in the mushroom hat that will attach with the magnet. So I'm just going to start by stitching, and this stitching doesn't have to be perfect. If it's not a perfect circle, it's not gonna hurt. Nobody is ever gonna see this part. It's just getting sewn into the seam in the frog's head so that you have a place, so you have a way to attach the hat so it won't just fall off, because the frog's head doesn't really hold the mushroom hat on very well, because it's just, you can't really pull the mushroom hat down on top of its head. Okay, so now I've stitched most of the way around, and now I'm just shoving my magnet in there and holding it as far away as I can from my foot. And it does attach to the base plate here, but you should still be able to stitch. And if you're concerned about having the magnet near your machine, you can always sew the pouch most of the way around, cut your threads, pull the thing off, put your magnet in, and then hand sew the little opening. I chose to do it this way. I think it's just faster. And I don't have an issue with my machine. Usually these things aren't strong enough that they're gonna do anything to a machine that's computerized. And now I'm just gonna take my pinking shears and trim around the outside of this stitching, because it doesn't need to, you don't need this big square. And it's not easy because the magnet wants to attach to the scissors, but you can do it. Okay, so that's all set. Now we need to put this in the frog. So I'm gonna grab the frog. And now this frog, we turned right side out, but I'm gonna turn his head back inside out, okay? And we're gonna attach the magnet pouch to the back seam. And you only want to stitch through the seam allowances. You don't want to stitch through the frog, so because you'll see that. So let's see, this is the back seam, because you can tell, because this is the dart with his mouth. So you want it on the seam opposite his mouth. And I'm just going to take the pouch and I'm just going through the seam allowance and just doing a simple whip stitch, because you just want to hold this thing in place. Okay. And I'm gonna do a knot here and trim that off. And then I'm going to go to the bottom of my little magnet pouch and attach that to, I'm gonna attach that to the back seam allowance, which is a little bit trickier since I trimmed it down, but I should be able to do it. And I'm being careful that I'm only going through the seam allowance and not into the frog's outer body where it would be seen. And then I'm going to tie this off. And I'm not trimming super close to the knot, because then that way, if the knot were to, it would take more for the knot to come untied that way. So now that's attached, okay? So now we can turn him completely right side out again. Okay. And if you feel, you'll feel the magnet right back here on his head. Okay. All right, now the next thing we need to do is sew the pellet pouch that adds weight to counteract the weight of the hat once we put it on him. So I am not going to stitch that for you because I did all of mine beforehand. So it's basically just stitch on the seam allowance. This pattern piece comes in the pattern and leaving an opening. And now I'm going to grab my pellets. My bucket of pellets here. And I'm going to hold this open. And I do it over my bucket, so then that way I don't have to worry about if they don't make it inside the pouch. And you don't have to fill the pouch to the point where it's bursting. You just want it to be full enough to add some weight. All right, that seems pretty good. And then I take a couple of pins. Oh, that's not a pin, that's a needle. Okay, and I pin my bucket of pellets. I don't pin the seam the way you normally would for sewing where, you know, you'd sew across. So I'm just pinning to hold the pellets as far away from where I need to stitch the seam as I can. So just to kind of tighten the fabric up around it, so I'm not trying to stitch over the plastic pellets. And then I'm just going to put this on and I'm going to sew that opening up. If you have a narrow presser foot for your machine, that works really well for this because you can stuff your pouch pretty full. All right, so that's all set to go in the frog. So the next thing that we are going to do is to actually, whoops, sorry about that, is to stuff the frog. So first we need to we need to stuff the legs, okay? I'm gonna stuff into the legs. And then once you get plenty of stuffing so that the seams are nice and pushed out, then you're gonna put your pellet pouch right in the bottom, right in his bum, okay? And you kind of want it centered, okay? And then you can finish filling the rest, stuffing the rest. So I'm gonna go grab my stuffing and then I'll do like a quick stitch or quick succession video for that where I'll speed it up because nobody wants to sit and watch me stuff a whole frog. My frog is all stuffed now. His pellet pouch is right down here, centered. Okay, and if it's not, you can kind of maneuver it around a little bit. Looks like it actually did come a little bit off center. So I'm just going to use my hemostats and I'm going to stick it up in there and just kind of manipulate it so it goes back more to where it needs to be. Okay, and that seams, and you can use a chopstick or another tool to just kind of push it back in place if it moved. Okay. pretty good, I think. It seems to keep him sitting a little bit forward because he's going to tip back a little bit when we put the hat on him. Okay, so now I have my needle and thread all prepped, and now I just need to stitch him closed. So I'm going to ladder stitch him closed. So I'm going to start by going from the inside to the outside with my needle so the knot is buried. And then I'm just going to take small little bites, making sure that they're perpendicular across. If they're not perfect, it's okay. It's just if they're not perfectly straight across from one another, if they're kind of zigzaggy, then your seam is going to look just a bit zigzaggy as well. Okay, so I got those, so that's my ladder stitch. And now I'm just going to pull it closed. And I just kind of try to blend it a little with my fingers to make sure everything looks good. It's nice and tight. Okay. Then I'm going to take one more stitch so I can tie a knot. And then now that I have the knot, I need to, that was still open just a bit. So I'm going to take one more stitch. I didn't quite get all the way to the end there. Okay. There we go. That's better. So now that I've had to fix that, I'm going to do one more stitch to make my knot. And then I want to bury my thread tail. So I'm going to stick my needle in right where that knot was. And I'm going to go about an inch or so off to the side. Pull my thread in, pull it really tight so it kind of puckers that a little bit. And then snip it right close to that. And then that way it'll suck back down inside and you won't have any thread tail sticking out. And then I just kind of give them a little brushing there to just kind of make that seam sit a little bit nicer. Okay. And now the frog is done, except for his feet and his little arms. So we're going to do those in the next section. Okay, now I'm going to show you how I do the limbs. If I don't have an embroidery file for them, I actually take my pattern piece and I cut off the seam allowance, and then I trace it onto a larger piece of fabric. Then, I trace it, and then I don't cut it out. Because what I've traced is the actual stitching line. So then I just put a few pins in to hold everything, and then I just stitch on the line I traced. So I'm going to do that. This is just, obviously this is white. It's not going to be for a frog. It's just a sample because I already did all the feet and the arms for the frogs. So I'm just going to stitch this one just to show you how I do this. And it's just a matter of following the line. So I stitched all the way around this. You can see there. that I stitched right on the line. And now I just need to cut this out. And when you cut it out, you'll get a piece like this. Okay, this is one of the ones I've done already. Okay, and I'm just checking to make sure I didn't snip anything. Okay, so now the next thing we need to do is we need to cut a little hole in here through one layer of the fabric. So I kind of pinch it and pull it apart and then just snip a little hole. And then I use my hemostats to turn it right side out. Okay. So once it's turned, I use the hemostats again to just kind of make sure all of the seams are pushed out. It works pretty well for that. You can grab the toe from the inside and push it out like it should be. Okay, and then once that's pushed out, then you can stuff it through that little hole. And the hemostats again work really good for this part here. So making sure that some stuffing gets up into each of those toes. And then fill in the remainder of the foot. Oh, I just poked right through there like that. You do have to be careful. So I will have to go back and fix that, which I can do because of the way this is going to get stitched onto the frog, I can take care of that when I actually attach it to the frog. Okay, but make sure you're careful when you're poking things out. So the next thing we need to do after this is we need to attach the limbs to the frog. So we have our frog body and we need to put our feet on. Okay, and we need to put our arms on. Okay, so I am going to find the right color of my thread here, and we're going to start with the feet. So I think that looks good enough. Okay. Oh, I actually have a needle with some of that thread on it already. So I'm just going to make a little knot in it so that I'm ready to go. And then I need to put the feet on. Okay. And you kind of want to put the feet like right at the bottom of the thighs there, like that. So now you can either hold it in place while you stitch. Some people like to stick a pin in to hold it in place. So whatever way works best for you. And then we're just going to, the same way that you sewed it up with a ladder stitch, we're just going to do that to attach the foot. Okay. So this is where I can take care of that little hole that I accidentally poked in this foot. Right, I'm just going to move this pin because the head of the pin was right where I needed to go next. So I'm just going to move that pin out of the way. And then I'm going to keep ladder stitching till I get close to the front here. And this is why it's okay to cut that little slit in the foot here to stuff through, because it's going to be hidden with your stitching. And then when you get to the front, you kind of want to pull back the toes a bit. Because you don't, obviously, you don't want to stitch around the toes and stitch those to the leg. So you just kind of have to be, in the front area of the foot. Just checking to make sure I didn't catch a toe with that thread. Sometimes it loops up and, okay. Yep, that looks good. I don't need the pin anymore. And then you come back to stitching. Whoops. See, that time I accidentally did loop around the toe. And then you just keep going around. And if you're worried about how well it's attached, you can go around with larger stitches first and then go around for a second pass that has finer stitches. Make sure we're attached well. And then we're going to do the thing where we make a knot and then take your needle, stick it in where you tied your knot, pull up about an inch or so away, pull tight and snip, and the thread tail will get pulled right back into your plush. So there's one foot. Now I just need to stitch on the other foot over here. And then when that's done, we need to attach the arms. So I'm going to do that. But I don't think anybody wants to watch me do that whole thing, so I will cut to a speed stitch of that section. Finished one little frog. All he needs is his little mushroom hat and he'll be all set to go. His magnets appear, waiting for the magnet for the hat. He's all stitched up, has all his limbs. One little frog.